What if I told you the scariest stories aren't found in movies but in real life? Welcome to Dark Domain, where nightmares are our specialty and peaceful sleep is strictly off limits. This 2-hour terror marathon is packed with stories that'll make you rethink every creak and whisper in the dark. So grab a snack, dim the lights, and get comfortable. Just remember, once you're in Dark Domain, there's no going back. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell us, what's the most bizarre dream you've ever had? And go ahead and hit that like button, because, let's be honest, you're not sleeping tonight anyways. Reflections of the Unseen. It was a warm evening when I first noticed something wrong with my reflection. I had just come home from a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital, my eyes aching from lack of sleep. Standing in front of the bathroom mirror, I splashed cold water on my face, hoping it would wake me up just enough to collapse into bed. But when I looked into the mirror, my reflection didn't quite match what I was feeling. It was subtle at first. My reflection blinked, but I hadn't. A split-second delay. My stomach nodded, but I convinced myself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. I blinked again. So did my reflection, perfectly in sync this time. I leaned in closer to the mirror, staring deep into my own eyes. That's when I noticed it. The pupil in my right eye had a strange distortion, a subtle, misshapen quality that wasn't there before. It looked like a tiny, fractured star, dark tendrils spidering out from the center. My breath hitched. I blinked once more. My reflection blinked back, but this time I saw it clearly. The pupil shifted, a slight ripple in the glass, almost as if something were moving behind it. Something alive. I took a step back. My reflection remained still for a moment longer than I did, as though reluctant to follow me. I rubbed my eyes hard, convinced that I was hallucinating from the lack of sleep. When I looked back, my reflection stood as it should, mirroring every movement, every shift of breath. Still, the discomfort lingered. The next day at work, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I kept catching my reflection in the glass of doors, windows, polished floors, and every time there was something slightly wrong. A flicker in my eyes, a delay in my movements. By the time my shift ended, the feeling had worsened. The sense of being watched was no longer something I could ignore. As I walked past a reflective glass door to leave the hospital, I froze. There, just for a split second, I saw my reflection, but the eyes didn't belong to me. They were larger, almost too large for my face, the pupils as black as voids with no light, no life behind them. And then, they blinked. I staggered back, my pulse racing. When I looked again, my reflection was normal, staring back at me with my tired, bloodshot eyes. But I couldn't shake the image of those black eyes, so impossibly dark that they seemed to absorb the light around them. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. I rushed home, avoiding every reflective surface I could. I didn't check the bathroom mirror. I didn't even glance at the hallway window. By the time I reached my apartment, I was on edge, the feeling of being watched now constant, heavy, pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't sleep. Instead, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But when I closed my eyes, the darkness behind my eyelids seemed to ripple and shift, like something was moving in it, watching. Days passed and things only got worse. Every time I looked in a reflective surface, whether it was a mirror, a window, or even the screen of my phone, I saw them. The eyes. They weren't always there, but they appeared often enough to drive me into a slow panic. Sometimes the reflection would hold them for a moment too long, and it wasn't just the eyes. My reflection started moving when I wasn't. I would stand perfectly still, and I would see my arm twitch in the glass, or my head would tilt slightly even though I hadn't moved. It was subtle, maddeningly subtle, but it was happening. I knew it was. One night, in an act of sheer desperation, I covered every reflective surface in my apartment. I draped sheets over the mirrors, taped paper over the windows, even turned my phone off. The sense of relief was immediate. like I had cut myself off from something I couldn't fully comprehend. That night, I finally slept. But it wasn't a peaceful sleep. I woke up in a strange room. At least I thought I was awake. The walls were lined with mirrors, floor to ceiling, stretching out in all directions. I was in the center of it all, standing on cold stone, surrounded by endless reflections of myself. Only, the reflections weren't exact copies. They were distorted, wrong. In the mirror closest to me, I was smiling, but my real mouth wasn't moving. In another mirror, my eyes were shut, while I stood there wide-eyed in horror. Every reflection was different. Some were subtle, just a blink or a twitch. Others were grotesque, warped versions of me with too many teeth, or eyes that were nothing more than gaping, dark holes. I turned in circles trying to find a way out, but the mirrors reflected nothing but the endless versions of me, versions that shouldn't exist. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I caught a glimpse of something in one of the farthest mirrors. A figure, tall and thin, draped in a tattered dark robe that seemed to merge with the shadows of the room. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, eyes that watched from behind the glass. I backed away, but the mirrors stretched on and on, the figure appearing in more reflections as I moved. It was everywhere, in every mirror, always at the edge of my vision, always watching. And then, it spoke. Not with words, but with a voice that seemed to vibrate through the glass itself.
You see what they hide. You are the chosen one.
I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out a hand, or something resembling a hand. Its fingers were long, impossibly thin, and they pressed against the inside of the mirror closest to me. The glass rippled, bending like liquid under its touch. The eyes, they watch you now. The voice hissed again, louder this time, like nails scraping across metal.
They want what is yours.
I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, the air thick and oppressive. I tried to turn away, but no matter where I looked, the figure was there, reflected in every surface, every version of me. And then, in the mirror directly in front of me, my reflection blinked. I hadn't blinked. The figure stepped closer, its face still hidden, but I could feel it now. Its presence pressing down on me, the weight of its gaze suffocating. My reflection moved again, reaching up to touch its face, its fingers brushing over its eyes, pulling at the skin. I couldn't stop it.
They want your sight.
And then, I felt it. The pressure behind my eyes, the horrible, wrenching sensation, as if something was trying to pry them out from the inside. My reflection dug its fingers deeper into its own eyes, the skin tearing, blood running down its cheeks as it smiled that same horrible smile.
They want to see through you.
I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the mirrors. My reflection laughed, a silent, grotesque laugh, its face now nothing but a bloodied mask with hollow sockets where its eyes had been. I jolted awake, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. My heart was hammering so hard it felt like it would break through my chest. I threw the sheets off and stumbled to the bathroom, desperate to wash my face, to ground myself in reality. But when I flipped on the light and looked in the mirror, the blood drained from my face. My eyes. My right eye had that same dark, fractured star, only now it was worse. The tendrils had spread, snaking across the iris like cracks in a broken window. And in the center of the pupil, I saw them, tiny dark figures writhing, watching. I blinked and the figures blinked with me. I no longer know if I'm awake or still trapped in that room of mirrors. All I know is that whatever is watching through my eyes, it's getting closer. And every time I look in the mirror, I can feel it. The weight of the collector's gaze, waiting for the moment when it can finally take what it came for. And I know it will. The lights above Mill Creek. I'd always heard stories about strange lights in the sky above Mill Creek, but I never believed them. Living in this quiet town for 35 years, I'd learned to dismiss the gossip as local folklore, nothing more than the product of overactive imaginations. That is, until the night I found myself standing beneath those very lights, my heart pounding and my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. My old dog, Ranger, lay at my feet, his ears twitching occasionally at the sound of a distant car or the rustle of leaves in the wind. Then, the hum stopped. It was so sudden, so complete, that I felt my skin prickle. Even Ranger perked up, his ears standing rigid as he let out a low growl. I sat up in my chair, the cold beer forgotten in my hand as a strange silence settled over the landscape. No wind, no cicadas, nothing. Just an eerie stillness. That's when I saw the lights. At first I thought it was a plane. Living near the mountains, we often had small aircraft fly over, usually tourists or folks heading to the nearby lake. But these lights weren't like any plane I'd ever seen. They were too bright, too steady. 3 of them, in a perfect triangular formation, hovered just above the tree line. They didn't move, didn't waver, just hung there, glowing against the darkening sky. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. Ranger barked once, a sharp, nervous sound that echoed off the trees. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped off the porch, walking toward the lights. Every rational part of me screamed to turn back, to get inside and lock the door, but my legs kept moving, driven by a force I couldn't explain. As I approached the edge of the woods, the lights began to move, slowly, almost deliberately, as if they were aware of my presence. They drifted silently above the trees, casting an otherworldly glow on the branches below. I felt a pull, an inexplicable urge to follow them, and before I knew it, I was deep into the forest, the familiar path to Mill Creek lost in the dim light. The air felt different here, thicker, heavier. Every step I took seemed to echo, though the ground was soft with pine needles. Ranger stayed close to my side, his hackles raised, but he didn't make a sound. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then the lights descended. They hovered just above the clearing ahead, illuminating the trees and casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. I stopped dead in my tracks, unable to move as a low, humming sound filled the air. It wasn't like any sound I'd ever heard, deep, vibrating in my chest, more felt than heard. Ranger whimpered and pressed against my leg, trembling. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the glow. It was human, or at least it looked human. A man, tall and thin with pale skin and wide, unblinking eyes. His clothes were strange, like something out of an old military uniform, but they were covered in dirt, torn in places. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, as if walking in a dream. "Help me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My throat felt dry, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Who was this man? Where had he come from? And more importantly, what were those lights? The man's eyes darted to the sky, and I followed his gaze. The lights were closer now, hovering just above us, bathing the clearing in an intense white glow. The humming grew louder, almost unbearable, and I felt a pressure in my ears as if the air itself was vibrating. "They're coming back," the man said, his voice filled with fear. "They always come back." Before I could react, the lights flared brighter, and I was hit with a wave of dizziness. The ground beneath me seemed to tilt, and I staggered backward, clutching a tree for support. Ranger barked wildly, but his voice sounded distant, muffled by the overwhelming hum that now surrounded us. The man turned to me, his eyes wide with desperation. "You have to help me. They won't stop. They never stop." And then, without warning, the lights surged forward, enveloping him in their glow. He let out a scream, a raw, agonized sound that cut through the air, and in an instant, he was gone. Just gone. The lights vanished with him, leaving nothing but darkness and silence in their wake. I collapsed to the ground, my head spinning. Ranger whined and licked my face, but I barely registered it. All I could think about was the man's words, his desperate plea for help. What had just happened? Who or what had taken him. I don't remember how I made it back to the house. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on my porch again, the cold beer still in my hand. The hum of the cicadas had returned, and the familiar sounds of the night filled the air once more. But something had changed. I had changed. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At night, I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the lights to return. Ranger wouldn't leave my side, as if he sensed something lurking just beyond the edge of the woods. And then, one night, they did return. I woke to the hum again, louder this time, more insistent. The lights were back, hovering just beyond the trees, casting their eerie glow over the yard. But this time I didn't move. I didn't follow them. I stayed in bed, my heart racing, waiting for the inevitable. The man's words echoed in my mind that they always come back. The Stranger's Carnival. It was the summer I turned 28 when I first saw the carnival. I'd been driving through a small, dusty town in the middle of nowhere, one of those places you'd only pass through on your way to somewhere better. The town itself was barely more than a gas station and a diner, but the carnival set up just outside the main road stood out, garishly colorful against the endless desert backdrop. It wasn't like any carnival I'd seen before. The tents were faded, the rides old and rickety, and the posters plastered along the entrance advertised acts straight out of a bygone era. The strongest man alive, the two-headed girl, the human skeleton. It felt more like a sideshow from the 1950s than anything modern, but something about it tugged at me. I was tired and needed a break from the long drive, so I figured, why not? A quick walk through the carnival could be a distraction before I got back on the road. I parked the car and made my way through the entrance, the dry wind kicking up dust around my feet. The place was strange from the start. Despite the loud carnival music that blared from hidden speakers, the grounds were almost empty. A few families wandered between the booths, but they all seemed disconnected from the festive atmosphere, like they were just going through the motions. The first performer I saw was a man billed as the strongest man in the world. He stood behind a small wooden stage, wearing a faded leopard print leotard. He must have been in his late 60s, his body frail and gaunt. Yet there he was, flexing his bony arms as if he were still in his prime. There was something off about the way his skin seemed to hang too loosely from his frame, like he was barely held together. I moved on quickly, not wanting to linger too long in front of him. Next, I passed by a tent advertising the Mermaid Woman. Curious, I stepped inside, half expecting to see some cheap gimmick, a woman in a fake fishtail floating in a glass tank. Instead, I found a woman lying motionless on a low platform, her body completely submerged in water, her long hair swirling in the current. There were no wires, no breathing apparatus. She didn't move, didn't blink, and I couldn't see her chest rise and fall with breath. A sign next to her said she had been living underwater for 10 years. I stared at her for what felt like forever, trying to figure out the trick, but there was none. The longer I watched, the more I realized that the water wasn't just clear. It had an unnatural stillness to it, like glass that rippled ever so slightly. Feeling a chill run down my spine, I backed out of the tent. The deeper I went into the carnival, the stranger it became. The booths were filled with old-fashioned games, ring toss, dart throws, and guess-your-weight stands. But the prizes were unsettling. Dusty old dolls with cracked faces, stuffed animals with missing eyes, and ancient rusted trinkets that looked like they had been salvaged from a junkyard. I was just about to leave when I saw the banner for the Human Enigma. It hung above a small tent in the far corner of the grounds, half hidden by overgrown weeds. The sign showed a blurry silhouette of a figure, its face obscured. Something about it drew me in, even though I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise the moment I laid eyes on it. Against my better judgment, I walked toward the tent and ducked inside. Inside, the tent was dimly lit by a single bulb that hung from the ceiling. In the center of the room stood a glass box, about 7 feet tall, completely opaque from the outside. I could see my own reflection staring back at me in the dark surface of the glass. There was no one else in the tent, no barker to explain the exhibit. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer to the box. As I did, The surface of the glass began to shimmer, like it was made of liquid rather than solid material. Slowly, an image began to form, something moving inside the box. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure came into view. It was me. I saw myself standing there, staring into the box, but there was something wrong with my reflection. The me in the box wasn't moving the same way I was. It was delayed, like I was watching a video with a few seconds of lag. My reflection's eyes were wide, unblinking, and its lips curled into a strange, unnatural smile. I backed away from the box, but the reflection didn't move. It just stood there, watching me with that eerie grin. Then, without warning, it pressed its hands against the glass, the smile growing wider, more distorted. The glass rippled under its touch, as if it was trying to push through, trying to get out. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I turned and bolted out of the tent. The strange, distorted image of myself still burned into my mind. As I ran, the carnival seemed to warp around me. The rides creaked louder, the lights flickered, and the air itself seemed to thicken. I could hear whispers, voices calling my name, but I couldn't make out where they were coming from. I ran past the strongest man, now collapsed in a heap, his body deflated like a balloon. I passed the mermaid woman, her eyes open and staring straight at me from beneath the water. And all the while, the whispers grew louder, as if the carnival itself was alive, trying to draw me back in. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I sped away from the carnival, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the tents disappearing into the distance. But they were gone. The road behind me was empty, nothing but desert stretching out as far as the eye could see. The carnival had vanished. I drove for hours after that, not daring to stop until I reached the next town. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, something I couldn't see. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the face from the glass box, the twisted version of me, grinning, waiting. And sometimes when I pass by a mirror, I swear I see it again, just out of the corner of my eye, watching, waiting for its chance to get out. The cold below. I never thought I'd return to Alaska. After spending my childhood up here, I swore I'd never go back. I always preferred cities with busy streets, fast cars, and crowds of people. But when the offer came in to do some maintenance work on an old research station in the wilderness outside Anchorage, I couldn't say no. The pay was good. And besides, a few days away from the chaos of Seattle didn't seem like such a bad idea. The station, as it turns out, wasn't just any research post. It had been built back in the 80s for geological studies, monitoring seismic activity and drilling deep into the ice. The funding dried up, and the place was abandoned, left to freeze under layers of snow and forgotten. My job was simple: assess the building, make any repairs necessary, and ensure the station was in working order for a new research team that was planning to move in. Simple, right? The helicopter dropped me off just outside the station. The pilot, a guy named Rick, didn't stick around long. As soon as I stepped out, he gave me a quick nod and took off. I watched as the helicopter disappeared into the gray sky, leaving me alone in the middle of nowhere. The cold hit me immediately. Even though I'd grown up in Alaska, I had forgotten how biting the cold could be, how it seeps into your bones and makes your breath hang in the air like a ghost. I pulled my jacket tighter and trudged through the snow toward the station. It was just as I expected, run down and covered in frost. The building had a couple of large windows, most of them cracked, and a rusting satellite dish perched on top. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the stale air hit me, a mixture of old machinery, must, and the faint smell of something metallic. Inside, the station was cramped but functional. The main room housed several workstations, a lab area, and a small living space where the researchers had once bunked. There was a storage room off to the side, filled with old equipment and drilling gear. I flicked on the lights, and after a few sputters, the fluorescent bulbs flickered to life. The power was still running, thank God for that. But I knew it wouldn't last long. My first task was to check the generator in the basement. The basement was a cold, damp room that smelled like rusted metal and something else I couldn't place. As I descended the stairs, I noticed how the walls were slick with condensation, even though the temperature outside was well below freezing. I made a mental note to check the ventilation system after I dealt with the generator. The generator itself was in decent shape, though it had a few signs of wear. I tinkered with it for a bit, replacing some parts and ensuring it was functioning properly. As I worked, I felt an odd sensation, like I was being watched. I glanced around the dim basement, but there was nothing but shadows and old equipment. Shaking off the feeling, I finished up and headed back upstairs. I had more work to do, patching up some cracks, checking the water supply, testing the communication system. It was during this last task that things started to get weird. The comm system was ancient, but it still worked. I was running a test, sending signals to check for any interference when I picked up something strange. It wasn't just static or garbled radio noise. It was a voice. At first, it was faint, barely audible. I adjusted the frequency, trying to get a clearer signal. And there it was again, muffled but unmistakable. A man's voice. Help. Trapped. I froze, listening intently. Underground. Can't. Cold. I immediately grabbed the headset, trying to respond. Hello? Who's there? Where are you? There was silence, just static. I tried again. Can you hear me? Where are you? Nothing. I stared at the radio in disbelief. Was someone else out here? Was this a distress call? I checked the system again, trying to figure out where the signal was coming from, but I couldn't pinpoint it. The signal had vanished. I told myself it was just an old recording, maybe some interference from another station. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The voice had sounded too real, too desperate. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that voice in my head, repeating over and over again. Trapped, underground, cold. Around midnight, I gave up on trying to rest and decided to go through some of the old files stored in the lab. Most of it was geological data, records of the drilling projects and weather patterns. But then I found something strange, an old notebook hidden behind a stack of dusty papers. The notebook belonged to one of the original researchers, a man named Dr. Alistair Clark. From the looks of it, he'd been one of the last people at the station before it shut down. As I flipped through the pages, I found entries describing their work, nothing unusual at first, just notes about the drilling progress and the samples they'd been collecting. But the last few entries, those were different. August 14th, 1987. We've hit something unusual in the ice core samples. The deeper we go, the more the temperature anomalies increase. It's impossible. Should be getting colder, but it's not. There's something down there. I can't explain it. August 16th, 1987. We've uncovered a void, an empty space beneath the ice. The drilling team wants to stop, but I need to know what's down there. There are noises. No one else can hear them, but I know they're real. August 20th, 1987. Something's wrong. We lost contact with the team below. I think we've awakened something. The others don't believe me. They want to leave, but I can't. Not until I understand. Not until I know what's beneath us. The last entry was scrawled, barely legible. August 23rd, 1987. It's here. It's in the ice. We never should have come here. We're not alone. I dropped the notebook, my heart racing. What had they uncovered? The next morning, I went back to the basement. The strange condensation on the walls had gotten worse, thick droplets running down the surface like the building was sweating. I could feel a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the outside cold. It felt wrong, like the air itself was tainted. I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A hatch in the far corner, almost hidden behind a stack of old equipment. It was small, rusted, and locked with a heavy latch. My gut told me to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I forced the latch open and pulled the hatch aside, revealing a narrow shaft leading down into darkness. A ladder was bolted to the side. disappearing into the void below. This must have been where they'd drilled, where they'd found the void mentioned in Clark's journal. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to walk away, but something pulled me toward it. That voice from the radio. Could someone really be trapped down there? I grabbed my flashlight and began to descend. The air grew colder as I climbed down, my breath coming out in frosty puffs. The walls were slick with ice, the metal rungs freezing to the touch. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the bottom and stepped into a narrow tunnel carved into the ice. It stretched ahead, disappearing into the darkness. I followed the tunnel, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The deeper I went, the more the temperature seemed to rise. The ice should have been solid, but I could feel warmth emanating from somewhere ahead. Then I saw it, a massive gaping chamber illuminated by faint blue light. In the center was something... a structure? No, it was organic. Massive tendrils of frozen flesh, twisted and coiled like roots of some ancient tree, encased in ice. And in the center of it all, a figure. A man, frozen solid, his eyes wide open, mouth twisted in a silent scream. It was Clark. The ice around him seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, breathing. And then I heard it again. His voice, the same one from the radio, echoing in my mind. Help. Trapped. Cold. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back at the hatch, back up the ladder and out of that station. I radioed for a helicopter, packed my gear, and waited outside in the freezing wind, far away from the building. I don't know what they uncovered down there, but I know one thing. I'm never going back. There's something beneath that ice, something alive, and it's been waiting. The Man in the Walls. My name is Joel Harris, and I used to think nothing ever really scared me. After serving 2 tours overseas in the military, I figured I had seen it all, the worst that humanity had to offer. But what happened to me here in Cincinnati? That's something I wasn't prepared for. It started a few weeks ago when I moved into an old apartment building downtown, one of those early 1900s brick places with narrow hallways and creaky floors. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a cheap place to live while I got back on my feet. The landlord, Mr. Feldman, was an older guy, hunched over and gruff. He seemed nice enough, but when he handed me the keys, he muttered something under his breath that stuck with me. "Don't mind the noises. Old buildings make all kinds of sounds." At the time, I didn't think much of it. Every old place has its quirks, right? But it didn't take long for me to realize that something wasn't right in that building. The first night I noticed it, a faint scratching noise, like something was moving behind the walls. At first I thought it was mice or rats. The building was old after all, but the noise wasn't random like you'd expect from an animal. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone, or something, was scraping at the walls, trying to get out. I knocked on the wall next to my bed, thinking I'd scare off whatever was making the noise, but the sound stopped immediately. For a moment, the room was dead silent. I stared at the wall, my hand still raised, waiting. Then from the other side there was a knock, 2 slow, deliberate taps. I jumped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just the pipes, some weird quirk of the building, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was inside those walls. The knocking didn't happen again that night, but I barely slept. Every little creak and groan in the apartment felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. A few days passed and I tried to settle in. The strange noises continued, but I tried to ignore them. Then, one morning, I found something that made it impossible to ignore any longer. I had just woken up and was heading to the bathroom when I noticed something strange on the floor near the baseboard. It was small, barely noticeable at first, just a bit of dust or plaster that had flaked off the wall. But when I crouched down to look closer, I saw it wasn't plaster. It was a fingernail, a human fingernail. My stomach turned. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand, hoping it was just some weird coincidence, something that had been stuck in the carpet for years. But the nail was fresh, clean. Someone had just lost it. I threw it in the trash and tried to brush it off, but that night, the knocking returned. Louder this time, more insistent. I didn't respond. I lay there in bed, gripping the covers, listening as the knocking moved down the wall toward the door. Then for the first time I heard it. A voice. Faint, muffled, but unmistakable. A whisper coming from inside the wall.
Help me.
The next day I confronted Mr. Feldman. I told him about the noises, the fingernail, the voice. He just stared at me with tired, bloodshot eyes and shook his head. "There's nothing in the walls, Harris," he said. "You're letting this place get to you." I pressed him, asked him if anyone else had complained, if something had happened here before. His response was the same. The building was old. It made sounds. End of story. But the look in his eyes told me there was more. He knew something, and he wasn't telling me. That night, the noises were worse. I couldn't sleep. The knocking and scratching constant, like something was crawling through the walls. And the voice, that same whisper, growing louder.
Help me.
I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a hammer from my toolbox and went to the bedroom wall, the source of the sound. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I had to know what was inside. I started tearing at the plaster, pulling chunks of the wall away, my heart racing with each swing. The wall crumbled easily, and soon I'd exposed a small section of the wooden framework beneath. But what I saw inside wasn't just old wood. There was a hole, small, barely big enough to notice at first. But as I shined my flashlight into the space between the walls, I saw it was much deeper than it should have been. A narrow crawl space, hidden behind the wall. And in the beam of my light, something moved. I jumped back, dropping the hammer. A hand, pale, thin, and filthy, reached out from the darkness, pressing against the wall from the other side. Then a face appeared, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and human. I scrambled backward, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure pushed itself forward, its limbs contorting unnaturally to squeeze through the narrow gap in the wall. The smell hit me next, like rotting meat and damp earth. "Help me," the voice said again, raspy and weak, but now unmistakably real. It wasn't just a voice in the walls. There was a man living inside the walls. I ran out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. The next morning, I went to the police. I told them everything, the noises, the fingernail, the man in the wall. They looked at me like I was crazy, but when I took them back to the apartment, they couldn't ignore the hole I'd smashed through the wall. They sent a team to investigate, tearing down more of the wall, searching the crawl space. That's when they found him. He was dead. Had been for at least a week, maybe longer. They said he'd been hiding in the walls for months, surviving off scraps of food he could steal from the apartments. The autopsy confirmed he'd been suffering from some kind of mental illness, probably schizophrenia. The police figured he'd been a squatter, moving between abandoned buildings for years. But that didn't explain everything. It didn't explain how he'd known I was there, how he'd whispered for help long after he should have been dead. They took the body away, sealed up the wall, and Mr. Feldman refused to answer any more questions. As far as he was concerned, the problem was solved. But I know the truth. That man wasn't just hiding in the walls, he was waiting. The things in the walls. I've been an exterminator in Denver for almost 10 years now. I've seen a lot. Infestations of rats, roaches, bats, you name it. But what I found in that old apartment building on 7th Avenue, that's something I'll never forget. My name's Ryan McGregor and I run a small pest control business. Just me and a van filled with traps, poison, and tools of the trade. Last week I got a call from a guy named Eddie, the superintendent of a rundown building in Capitol Hill. He sounded rattled, said they had a major infestation of some kind, but he wasn't sure what. "It's not just rats, man," Eddie said over the phone. "There's something weird going on. Tenants are complaining about noises, scratching in the walls, stuff moving around." I've dealt with weird calls before, but something about Eddie's voice caught my attention. He sounded more than just annoyed. He sounded scared. So I grabbed my gear and drove over. The building was a relic from the 1930s, one of those old brick buildings that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Paint peeling from the walls, flickering hallway lights, and that musty smell that only comes from decades of neglect. Eddie met me in the lobby, nervously wringing his hands. "Thanks for coming, man," he said. "Tenants have been calling me at all hours. They swear there's something in the walls, but I can't find anything." "No problem," I said, trying to keep things light. "I'll check it out. Probably just rats." Eddie shook his head. "I don't think it's rats." He led me up to the third floor and down a narrow hallway. The place was eerily quiet, like the tenants were all holding their breath. We stopped outside apartment 308. "This is where it's worst," Eddie said, his voice low. "Tenants been complaining non-stop." I knocked on the door, but no one answered. Eddie unlocked it, and we stepped inside. The place was empty, but you could tell someone had been living there recently. Dishes in the sink, a half-packed suitcase on the bed, an open newspaper on the table. "They took off yesterday," Eddie explained. "Said they couldn't sleep with the noise anymore." I set down my gear and started checking the walls, tapping here and there, listening for hollow spots. Everything seemed normal at first, just the usual creaks and groans of an old building. But then I heard it, a faint scratching like something dragging its nails against the inside of the wall. I pressed my ear to the plaster. It was coming from inside the walls, but it didn't sound like rats. It was bigger, heavier. I felt a chill creep up my spine. "You hear that?" I asked Eddie. He nodded, his face pale. "That's the noise. It's been getting louder." I decided to start cutting into the wall. If there was something living in there, I'd find it. I grabbed my utility knife and made a small cut in the drywall. As soon as the blade pierced the surface, the scratching stopped. Eddie took a step back, his eyes wide. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just old wooden beams and insulation. But then I spotted it. Something shiny tucked behind one of the beams. I reached in and pulled it out. It was a small metal object, an old locket covered in dust and grime. "What's that doing in there?" Eddie asked, leaning in for a closer look. Before I could answer, the scratching started again, louder this time. It was coming from the ceiling. We both looked up, and that's when I saw it. A dark stain spreading across the ceiling tiles, something wet dripping down. "Jesus," Eddie muttered. "What the hell is that?" I grabbed my flashlight and shined it up at the stain. The beam cut through the darkness, and that's when I saw the outline of something moving behind the tiles. Slow, deliberate. I stepped back, my heart pounding. "There's something up there." Eddie took a step toward the door. "I'm calling the cops." "No, wait," I said. "Let me check the crawl space first. If something's living in there, I need to know what we're dealing with." Against my better judgment, I climbed up to the attic crawl space. It was dark and cramped, barely enough room to move. The smell hit me first, damp, rotting wood mixed with something else, something metallic. As I crawled deeper into the space, my flashlight flickered, and that's when I saw it. The walls were covered in scratches, deep gouges like something or someone had been clawing at the wood. I moved the light across the space and froze. There was a hole in the wall, just big enough for someone to crawl through. And around the edge of the hole, the wood was slick with something dark. Blood. I heard a sound behind me and I whipped around, shining the light into the darkness. Something moved. A shape, pale, hunched, and impossibly thin, crawled out of the shadows, its limbs twisted, its skin slick with grime. Its eyes glinted in the light, black and hollow, and it smiled, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I scrambled backward, my heart racing, but the thing moved faster, slithering through the crawl space with unnatural speed. I tumbled down from the attic, crashing into the apartment below, my head spinning. Eddie rushed over, his face pale. What happened? What did you see? Get out, I gasped, pulling myself to my feet. We need to get out. Now. We ran from the apartment, slamming the door behind us. I didn't stop until we were outside, standing in the cold night air, both of us gasping for breath. What the hell was that thing? Eddie whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't answer. I didn't know. I never went back to that building. Eddie called the police, and they sent a team to check the place out, but they didn't find anything. No creature, no evidence of what I saw in the crawl space. Just that old locket and the scratches in the walls. But I know what I saw. There's something living in that building. Something that's been there a long time, hiding in the walls, waiting. Echoes of Mercy. I never thought a job in nursing would lead me to question everything I believed about life and death. My name is Mark Doyle, and I work as an orderly at St. Augustine Care Home, an old, crumbling facility for the elderly in New Orleans. The place isn't much, a bit run down with cracked walls and that damp, musty smell that clings to everything. Most of the patients have been here for years, either forgotten by their families or waiting for time to catch up with them. I've seen a lot of strange things in my few years here. When you're surrounded by people who have one foot in the grave, you get used to the odd things they say or do. The mind plays tricks on you when you're that close to the end. At least that's what I always thought. But what happened last week has me questioning everything. It started with Mr. Chasson, one of the residents on the second floor. He was 85, suffering from dementia, and had been bedridden for the better part of a year. He barely spoke, and when he did, it was gibberish. Fragments of memories, confusion, all jumbled up. I'd seen the decline happen slowly, week by week, until he was little more than a shadow of the man he used to be. Then, out of nowhere, things changed. I was making my rounds one night, checking on the residents before my shift ended. When I reached Mr. Chasson's room, I heard something strange. At first, I thought it was the TV, but as I got closer, I realized it was his voice. He was talking. Not the usual incoherent rambling, but a full conversation. I stood outside the door, listening. His voice was strong, clear, like he hadn't been bedridden for months. He was speaking to someone, but as I opened the door, I saw he was alone. "Mr. Chasson?" I asked, stepping into the room. He turned his head toward me, and for the first time in months, he looked present. His eyes weren't clouded with confusion. They were sharp, focused. "You can hear them, can't you?" he said, his voice low but steady. "Hear who?" I asked, my heart picking up speed. He smiled, a cold, distant smile. "The ones in the walls. They're coming." The next day, I mentioned it to Dr. Emery, the head of the facility. He brushed it off, said it was just a moment of clarity, something that happens with dementia patients from time to time. "They get these bursts of lucidity right before the end," he said. "Don't think too much of it." But I couldn't shake it. The way Mr. Chasson had spoken, the certainty in his voice, it wasn't just some random burst of memory. He was sure of what he was saying. That night, as I was leaving the building, I passed by the second-floor hallway and heard it again. The sound of voices. This time, they weren't coming from Mr. Chasson's room. They were coming from the walls. I stopped, my hand on the doorframe, and listened. It was faint but unmistakable. Whispers, dozens of them, all speaking at once. The words were too quiet to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. Fear. Pain. I stood frozen for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes before the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Heavy, suffocating, like the building itself was holding its breath. The next few nights, things escalated. More residents began reporting strange occurrences, hearing footsteps in the halls when no one was there, feeling cold hands touch their skin in the middle of the night. Some said they saw figures, shadows that moved through the walls and disappeared before they could scream for help. The other orderlies and nurses were on edge, whispering about ghosts and hauntings, but no one wanted to admit something was wrong. And then Mr. Chasson died. It happened during the night, quietly, without warning. He had been fine, or as fine as someone in his condition could be, just hours before. When we found him in the morning, there was no sign of struggle, no apparent cause of death. He just stopped. But there was something odd about the way his body looked. His face. He had this expression, one I'd seen before on other patients. It wasn't peace. It was terror, frozen in place like he'd seen something in his final moments that none of us could understand. That same day, 2 other residents passed, both of them with that same look on their faces. After that, the whispers got louder. Every night as I made my rounds, I could hear them. Those voices growing stronger. It wasn't just the walls anymore. They were coming from the vents, the floors, the ceiling. It was like the entire building was alive with them, a constant murmur just beneath the surface. And the shadows, those dark, shifting shapes that appeared at the edge of my vision, became more frequent. I'd see them in the corners of the residents' rooms, standing silently by their beds, or sometimes just drifting through the halls. No one else seemed to notice. Or maybe they did, but were too scared to admit it. I started staying late after my shift, trying to figure out what was happening. I searched through old records, looking for anything that might explain the strange events. That's when I found it. St. Augustine Care Home wasn't always a nursing facility. Decades ago, it had been something else. A hospital, but not the kind you think of. It was a place where they sent people to be forgotten, a place for those society didn't want to deal with anymore. The records were vague, but I found references to experimental treatments, things that weren't exactly ethical. Electroshock therapy, lobotomies, isolation. The patients who were brought here weren't meant to leave. According to the files, many of them didn't. I confronted Dr. Emery the next day, asked him if he knew about the building's history. At first, he denied it, said it was all in the past, nothing to worry about. But the way he avoided my eyes told me he knew more than he was letting on. "They're still here, aren't they?" I said, my voice shaking. "The people who died in this place, they're still trapped here." He didn't answer. He just looked at me, his face pale, and said, "You should let it go, Mark. Some things are better left buried." I couldn't let it go. That night, I went back to the second-floor hallway, the place where I'd first heard the whispers. I stood there in the dark, waiting, listening. At first, it was quiet. Then, slowly, the voices returned. Louder this time, clearer. I could hear them crying out, begging for release, for someone to acknowledge their pain. They weren't just voices. They were people. People who had suffered, who had been forgotten. And then I saw them. Figures, pale and translucent, moving through the walls, their faces twisted in agony. They reached out for me, their hands brushing against my skin, cold and desperate. I ran. I don't work at St. Augustine anymore. After that night, I couldn't stay. The whispers, the shadows, the things I saw. It was too much. I don't know what's still trapped in that building, but I know it's not at peace. There are echoes of the past in that place, echoes of suffering and torment that have never faded. The people who died there, who were mistreated and forgotten, are still there, still waiting for someone to acknowledge them. But no one wants to listen. The Marionette's curse. I never believed in curses. That kind of superstition seemed out of place in the modern world, like something out of an old folk tale. But all of that changed when I inherited my grandmother's house. It wasn't the house itself that bothered me. It was old, sure, and full of creaking floors and drafty windows, but it was more or less what I expected. My grandmother had lived there alone for the last decade of her life, a solitary figure after my grandfather's passing. When she passed away, the house came to me, along with everything inside it. The first time I saw the marionette, it was tucked away in an old wooden chest in the attic, wrapped in a yellowed cloth. I wasn't looking for it. I'd just been cleaning out the attic, deciding what to keep and what to throw away. But as soon as I pulled back the cloth, I felt an immediate chill run down my spine. The marionette was an antique, beautifully crafted. Its wooden face was smooth and intricately painted, with wide glass eyes that seemed to sparkle in the dim attic light. Its arms and legs hung limply, attached to strings that led to a small wooden cross used to manipulate it. But there was something about it that unnerved me. The eyes, though expertly made, seemed too lifelike, too aware. I'd heard stories about my grandmother's obsession with puppetry when she was younger, but I never thought much of it. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that washed over me as I held the marionette in my hands. I almost put it back in the chest, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to bring it downstairs, thinking it would make an interesting piece for the living room. That was my first mistake. From the moment I placed the marionette on the mantelpiece, things began to change in the house. Small things at first. The lights would flicker for no reason. Doors that I knew I had closed would be open when I returned to the room. I would hear soft, almost imperceptible tapping sounds coming from the walls late at night, like someone gently knocking. Then, the dreams started. Every night for a week, I dreamed of the marionette. In the dream, I was sitting in the living room watching TV. But when I glanced over at the mantelpiece, the marionette wasn't hanging limp from its strings anymore. It was sitting upright, its head tilted slightly, its wide glass eyes fixed on me. It never moved, at least not when I was looking. But every time I blinked or turned my head, I could sense it shifting, like it was creeping closer, watching, waiting. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. But even in the daylight, the unease stayed with me. I began to avoid the living room, leaving the TV off and spending most of my time in the kitchen or upstairs in the bedroom. I thought about getting rid of the marionette, but something held me back. Maybe it was a sense of obligation to my grandmother, or maybe it was something more, something I didn't want to admit to myself. One evening, after a particularly long and restless day, I heard the sound of footsteps in the house. At first, I thought I was imagining it. After all, the house was old and prone to settling noises. But as the sound grew louder, I realized it wasn't coming from upstairs or outside. It was coming from the living room. My stomach twisted as I made my way toward the source of the noise. The hallway seemed longer than usual, the shadows on the walls stretching and distorting. The sound of footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the living room door and slowly pushed it open. There, in the middle of the room, stood the marionette. It wasn't hanging from its strings anymore. It was standing on its own two wooden feet, its arms bent awkwardly at its sides. Its head was tilted up, those glass eyes now trained directly on me. I froze in the doorway, my mind reeling. It wasn't possible. It couldn't move on its own. And then, it smiled. The marionette's painted lips curled upward in a slow, unnatural grin. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The room felt cold, so cold I could see my breath fogging in the air. The marionette took a step forward, its wooden joints creaking as it moved. I turned and ran. My feet pounded on the wooden floor as I sprinted up the stairs, not daring to look back. I slammed the bedroom door behind me and locked it, my chest heaving with panic. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were slow, deliberate, growing louder as they climbed the stairs. The handle of the door rattled. I backed up against the wall, my heart pounding in my throat. The rattling grew more insistent, more frantic, until the door burst open with a loud crack. I screamed, but the room was empty. There was nothing there. Nothing but the icy chill that had followed me from downstairs. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner, too terrified to sleep, too afraid to close my eyes. I waited for the marionette to appear, for those cold glass eyes to find me again. But it never came. By morning, I knew I had to get rid of it. Whatever connection my grandmother had to the marionette, Whatever curse it carried, I didn't want any part of it. I grabbed it from the living room, wrapped it in a sheet, and drove out to the old quarry just outside town. Without hesitation, I tossed the Marionette into the deepest pit I could find and left, not daring to look back. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly that night. But as the days passed, something began to gnaw at me. I could still hear the tapping sometimes, faint but unmistakable. And when I passed by mirrors, I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, like a wooden figure standing just behind me watching. And then one night I woke up to the sound of footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs. I sat up in bed, my heart racing as the door to my bedroom creaked open. And there it was, the Marionette. It smiled at me with those same glass eyes, and this time I knew. There was no escaping it. The passenger. I never should have picked him up. That's what I tell myself now, over and over, as I replay the moment in my mind. I was just trying to help, just trying to do the right thing. But I'll never forget the look on his face. It started like any other day. I was driving back from my sister's place, cutting through the barren stretch of highway that connected her small town to mine. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows over the empty road. That's when I saw him. A man on the side of the highway stumbling toward the road with his arm raised for a ride. I almost drove past him. I should have. But something about the desperation in his eyes made me slow down. His face was pale, his clothes disheveled, and he was holding his head with one hand, as if he was in pain. I pulled over, and before I could even ask him if he was okay, he yanked open the passenger door and collapsed into the seat, panting and wild-eyed. "Drive," he gasped. "Please, just drive." I hesitated for a moment, the rational part of me screaming to get him out of the car. But something about the way he said it, the panic in his voice, made me press the gas. The car sped forward, and I could feel the tension radiating off him as he clutched his head, breathing heavily. For the first few miles, neither of us spoke. I kept glancing over at him, waiting for an explanation, but he just stared straight ahead, his fingers digging into his scalp. His face was slick with sweat, his knuckles white. Finally, I couldn't take the silence anymore. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Do you need a hospital or something?" He shook his head violently, grimacing like the words themselves hurt him. "No hospital, no stopping. You have to keep driving." "Why?" I pressed. "What's going on?" He turned to me, his eyes wide with fear. "If we stop, I die." I opened my mouth to protest, to demand some sort of explanation, but he cut me off. "Look, I don't have time to explain. It's in my head. It's killing me. If I stop moving, if we slow down, it'll crush my brain." I stared at him, not knowing what to say. He sounded insane, but there was something in his eyes. Something raw, primal, that made me hesitate. His face was twisted in agony, and the way he clutched his head made me wonder if he was really in pain. "I was running," he muttered. "It started this morning. Pressure. Like my head was going to explode. I thought it was just a migraine, but it kept getting worse. Then it started. The only way to keep it at bay is to keep moving. The faster, the better." "What do you mean, it?" I asked, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. "What's in your head?" He shook his head again, wincing. "I don't know. It's a sound. It's like there's something inside me, screaming, pushing against my skull. I can't stop moving or it'll..." He broke off, doubling over in the seat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Please, just keep driving." I should have pulled over. I should have called for help. But the fear in his voice, the sheer desperation, made me keep my foot on the gas. We drove for what felt like hours, the empty road stretching out endlessly in front of us. Every time I slowed down, even slightly, he'd cry out in pain, clutching his head harder and begging me to go faster. The speedometer crept higher and higher, and I found myself pushing the limits of what my car could handle. But then, the pressure in the air began to change. It wasn't just him anymore. I felt it too. It started as a low hum, barely noticeable, like the faint buzz of a far-off engine. But soon it grew louder, a constant, oppressive vibration that filled the car, pressing against my ears and making my skull throb. I glanced over at the man who was now writhing in his seat, his eyes squeezed shut, his teeth gritted in pain. "It's getting worse," he groaned. "We're not going fast enough." "What do you mean?" I shouted, the panic rising in my voice. "How fast do we need to go?" He didn't answer, just clenched his jaw and pointed forward, urging me to drive faster. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, the car shuddering as the speedometer climbed past 90, then 100. The hum in the air was deafening now, a physical force pressing down on us from all sides. My vision blurred as my head pounded, the pressure building inside my own skull, threatening to split it open. And then suddenly the man screamed. It was a horrible guttural sound, like he was being torn apart from the inside. His hands flew to his head, his fingers clawing at his scalp as if trying to rip something out. His eyes bulged, and blood began to trickle from his nose and ears. "We're not going to make it," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "It's too late." The car jolted and I swerved, nearly losing control. The man's body convulsed, his head snapping back as the pressure inside him reached its breaking point. With one final, sickening crack, his head collapsed inward, as if an invisible force had crushed his skull from the inside. I screamed, slamming on the brakes as the car skidded to a stop in the middle of the empty road. The hum in the air faded almost instantly, leaving only a ringing in my ears and the heavy thud of my own heartbeat. I sat there trembling, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. The man's body lay motionless beside me, his face unrecognizable, his head shattered. For what felt like an eternity, I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the blood-spattered windshield, the eerie silence pressing in on me from all sides. Then slowly the hum returned. This time it wasn't coming from him. It was coming from me. I felt the pressure building inside my head, the same relentless force pushing against my skull. My vision blurred, my ears rang, and I knew I had to move. I had to get away, to outrun whatever it was that had taken him. With shaking hands, I started the car, the engine roaring to life. And I drove. The Disappearing Room. My name is Paul Nichols, and I've lived in Boulder, Colorado for most of my life. It's a peaceful city, tucked away near the mountains, known more for hiking trails and craft beer than anything particularly strange. But something happened to me last month that I can't explain, something that still haunts me every time I close my eyes. I'm an architect by trade. I work on residential projects mostly, designing sleek, modern homes for people with more money than they know what to do with. About a month ago, I got a call from a client who wanted to remodel an old mansion on the outskirts of Boulder. The place had been abandoned for years, sitting at the end of a long, winding road surrounded by forest. It had good bones, though, and the client wanted to turn it into a vacation home. I was excited about the project. Old houses like that always have interesting quirks, hidden details, things that make them unique. The mansion, known as the Arvada House, was built in the early 1900s, and the architecture was stunning. High ceilings, intricate woodwork, the kind of craftsmanship you don't see anymore. When I first arrived at the house, everything seemed normal. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, and the interior was a little dusty, but it was exactly what I expected. I spent the better part of the day walking through the rooms, taking measurements, jotting down notes. The place was massive, with long hallways, hidden staircases, and more rooms than I could count. But something felt off. It was subtle at first, a feeling of being watched, of not being alone. Every now and then, I'd hear a faint creak from the floor above, or the whisper of wind through a crack in the wall. Old houses make noise, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. Then I found the room. It was at the end of the second-floor hallway behind a door that didn't match the rest of the house. The door was smaller, older, the wood warped and faded. I almost missed it entirely, tucked away in a shadowy corner. When I opened it, I was hit with a rush of cold air. The room beyond was dark, windowless, and empty, except for a single chair sitting in the center. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the floor coated in dust. It looked like no one had stepped foot in there for decades. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing strangely in the small space. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp wood and mildew. As I walked further into the room, I felt a strange pressure in my chest, like the air itself was pushing against me. I stood in front of the chair, trying to make sense of the room's purpose. Why would a house like this have a hidden room? I was about to turn back when I heard something, a faint humming noise. It was low, almost imperceptible, but it seemed to vibrate through the walls. I pressed my hand against the plaster, and for a moment, it felt like the wall was pulsing under my palm. And then the door slammed shut. I jumped, my heart racing. I rushed back to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I pounded on the wood, shouting, but the sound seemed to get swallowed up by the room, disappearing into the thick air. I was trapped. The humming grew louder. I turned, looking back at the chair in the center of the room. The air around it shimmered, almost like heat rising off asphalt. But it wasn't heat I was feeling. It was cold, so cold that my breath fogged up in front of me. I backed away, panic setting in, but no matter how much I pulled on the door, it wouldn't move. Suddenly, the room seemed to shift. The walls pressed in, the space around me growing smaller, tighter. The wallpaper began to peel away, revealing strange symbols etched into the wood beneath. Symbols I didn't recognize. My head throbbed as the humming filled my ears louder and louder until it was all I could hear. Then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The door swung open and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. The house was silent again, the oppressive weight gone. I turned to look back at the room, but the door, it wasn't there. The wall where the door had been was solid, seamless. No sign of the small, warped door I had walked through just moments before. I ran down the stairs, my heart pounding, and left the house without looking back. That night, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I went over my notes, my sketches of the house's layout, trying to find any mention of that room. But it wasn't there. I had mapped every hallway, every room, every corner of that house, and there was no record of a room at the end of the second-floor hallway. The next day, I went back to the mansion with a crew to start the renovation. I wanted to prove to myself that what I'd seen was real, that the room existed. But when I went up to the second floor, the door wasn't there. The hallway ended at a solid wall. I asked the crew to check the walls, see if there had been any renovations, any signs of a hidden room. They found nothing. The wall was solid, just like the rest of the house. I even went through the house's original blueprints, but there was no mention of any room where I had been. It was like the room had never existed. But I know what I saw. I know I walked through that door. I know I heard the humming, felt the air press in around me. And I know that the room, whatever it was real. Now, every time I close my eyes, I see that chair in the center of the room. I hear the humming, feel the cold creeping up my spine. I haven't been back to the Arvada house since, and I don't plan to. But sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear it. The low, faint hum. And I wonder if the room is still there waiting for me to find it again. Or worse, if it will find me. The Lake's Whisper. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest, you get used to the rain, the gray skies, the mist that clings to the trees, the constant patter of water against the roof. It becomes part of you. But some storms are different. Some storms bring more than just rain. My name is Will Hayes, and I'm a detective with the Eugene Police Department. Most of my cases deal with the usual, a string of burglaries, the occasional homicide, but nothing out of the ordinary. That all changed last month when I was assigned to the disappearance of Kevin Grayson. It wasn't just another missing persons case, it became something more, something I still can't explain. It was early November. the kind of cold, wet season that clings to everything. Kevin, a 16-year-old high school junior, had gone missing while camping with friends at Fern Ridge Lake, just outside the city. He and a group of friends had decided to spend the weekend at one of the remote campsites by the water, enjoying the last bit of fall before winter fully set in. According to his friends, Kevin had wandered off after dark. They thought he was playing a prank or maybe just clearing his head, but he didn't come back. The next morning, they found his tent empty, his boots still sitting outside the flap. No one had heard or seen anything. When I got to the scene, the first thing I noticed was the stillness. The air was thick, heavy with fog rolling off the lake, and there was an eerie quiet that settled over the camp. It didn't feel like a place where someone had just vanished. It felt like a place where someone had been taken. We brought in search teams, dogs, even helicopters. But after 2 days, there was still no sign of Kevin. No tracks, no clues, nothing. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. But then something strange happened. On the third day, we found Kevin's jacket, draped neatly over a tree branch near the water's edge. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, nothing to suggest foul play. But something about the way the jacket was placed, deliberate, almost ritualistic, sent a chill down my spine. That's when I met Jacob Brunner. Jacob was a local fisherman, an old man who lived in a cabin on the other side of the lake. He'd been around longer than most, knew the area better than anyone. He'd been watching the search from a distance, keeping to himself, but on the fourth day he approached me as I was walking along the shore. "You won't find him," Jacob said, his voice low, rough like gravel. "Not unless the lake wants you to." I looked at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" He gestured to the water, his eyes narrowing. "There are things in this lake, Detective. Things older than this town, older than all of us. People think they come here to camp, to fish, to relax. But the lake has a way of keeping things." I shook my head, brushing off his cryptic words. "We're doing everything we can to find him. If you know something, you need to tell me." Jacob just stared at the water, his expression distant. "Sometimes the lake whispers. If you listen, you might hear it." That night, the storm rolled in. The wind howled through the trees, the rain pouring down in sheets, making it impossible to search. The campsite was a mess, and most of the search teams had pulled back, waiting for the weather to clear. But I couldn't leave. Something about what Jacob had said, about the lake keeping things, kept gnawing at me. I stood by the shore, staring out into the dark water, the waves churning violently as the storm raged overhead. And then I heard it. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I listened closer, I realized it was something else. A voice. Faint, almost drowned out by the rain, but unmistakable. It was Kevin's voice calling for help. I grabbed my flashlight and moved closer to the water, scanning the shoreline. The voice was getting louder, more urgent, and I could feel my heart racing in my chest. But no matter where I looked, there was no sign of him. Just the empty lake and the storm. "Kevin!" I shouted into the darkness, my voice barely carrying over the wind. "Where are you?" The voice stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the storm and the crashing waves. I stood there, drenched, waiting for something, anything. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw it. A figure standing in the water, waist deep. It was Kevin. His eyes were wide, his face pale, his clothes soaked through, but he wasn't moving. He just stood there, staring at me with a blank expression. I ran toward him, splashing through the water. "Kevin, stay where you are, I'm coming." But as I got closer, something felt wrong. His eyes, there was something off about them. They weren't focused on me, they weren't focused on anything. It was like he was in a trance, standing there like a statue, oblivious to the storm around him. I reached out, grabbing his arm, trying to pull him toward the shore. His skin was ice cold and he didn't respond, didn't resist, just stood there, staring blankly ahead. "Kevin, we have to go," I shouted, but it was like he didn't even hear me. That's when I heard the whisper again, but this time it wasn't Kevin's voice, it was something else. Something deep, resonant, like the voice of the lake itself. It echoed in my head, filling my thoughts, growing louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. Leave him. He's ours. I stumbled back, my head spinning. The whispering was relentless, swirling around me like the storm, like the very air was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I looked back at Kevin, but his face had changed. His eyes had gone dark, empty. And then, slowly, he began to walk backward, deeper into the water. No! I lunged forward, trying to grab him, but the lake seemed to pull him away, the waves rising up around him, swallowing him whole. Within seconds, he was gone, vanished beneath the surface. The whispering stopped. The next morning, the storm had passed. The lake was calm, almost serene, as if nothing had happened. But Kevin was still gone. The search continued for another week, but we never found him. Not a trace, not a body, just the lake, quiet and indifferent, holding its secrets beneath the surface. I went back to see Jacob after that, demanding answers. But his cabin was empty. He was gone too. No one had seen him leave. No one knew where he went. It was like he'd disappeared, just like Kevin. I still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, and the rain taps softly against my window. They're faint, but they're there, always there. The lake doesn't give up its secrets. Not easily. And some nights I wonder if it's watching me, waiting for the day it decides to take me too. The Devils of Silver Creek. I've been the sheriff of Silver Creek for about 5 years now. It's a quiet town nestled in the Rocky Mountains with just over 3,000 people. Nothing much happens here besides the occasional tourist getting lost on a hike or a petty crime involving someone having too many beers at the local bar. But last month, something changed, something that turned our little mountain town upside down. My name is Jason Mills, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around the strange, dark events that unfolded in our town, a story that I'm not sure anyone will believe. But it's true. I lived it. It started with a death. Brandon Hawks, a local high school football player, was found dead in the forest, not far from his home. He'd gone missing after a party one Friday night, and by the time we found him, it was too late. The medical examiner said it was an accident. Brandon had fallen, hitting his head on a rock near the creek. But something about the scene didn't sit right with me. His body was lying too neatly, like it had been placed there. And his face was frozen in an expression of sheer terror, like he had seen something before he died. Something no one could explain. We filed the report as an accidental death, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. A few days later, we got another call. Eli Dunham, another high school student, was found in almost the exact same spot as Brandon. Dead, the same expression of terror on his face, his body unmarked aside from the same kind of head injury. The two deaths were eerily similar, but this time there were witnesses. According to some of the kids who had been with Eli that night, he had been arguing with two girls from the high school, Megan Bryant and Casey O'Neill. They'd been friends for years, inseparable, and known for being a little off. Not dangerous, just strange. The kind of girls who seemed to enjoy causing trouble, but nothing too serious. The kids who were at the scene said the argument had gotten heated. They said that when Megan and Casey walked away, Eli suddenly collapsed, his face twisted in fear. They swore they hadn't seen anyone touch him, but it was like something had come over him, something invisible. I decided to pay Megan and Casey a visit. They lived on opposite sides of town, but I started with Megan. She lived with her mother, a widow, in a small house near the woods. When I knocked on the door, Megan answered, her face unreadable. "Sheriff Mills," she said, her voice calm, too calm. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to ask you a few questions about Eli Dunham," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. I heard you two had an argument the night he died. She shrugged. Yeah, we argued, but that's all it was. Kids argue, right? Her expression was flat, but something in her eyes made me uneasy. There was no sadness, no remorse, just emptiness. I heard that after the argument, Eli collapsed, I said carefully. Do you know anything about that? Megan looked me dead in the eye and smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was cold, calculating. I didn't touch him, Sheriff. Maybe he just couldn't handle it. Her words sent a chill down my spine, and I left her house feeling more unsettled than when I'd arrived. That night, things escalated. I got a call around midnight from one of my deputies, Lisa Porter, who lived on the outskirts of town. She sounded panicked, something I wasn't used to hearing from her. Sheriff, you need to come here now, she said, her voice shaking. It's Megan and Casey. Something's wrong. I raced to her house, my heart pounding. When I arrived, Lisa was standing outside, pale as a ghost. They were here, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how, but they were here. I saw them in the driveway, just standing there, staring at me. Where are they now? I asked, scanning the dark woods surrounding her property. They're gone. But, Sheriff, there was something else. She paused, looking around nervously before continuing. It was like the air around them was different, like it was charged with electricity. I didn't know what to make of that, but I knew one thing. Something was going on with those girls, and I needed to figure it out before anyone else got hurt. The next day, I brought Megan and Casey into the station. I didn't have anything solid to charge them with, but I figured I could at least question them and maybe shake loose some answers. They sat across from me in the small interrogation room, side by side, both with that same eerie calmness. They didn't seem nervous or scared, just bored. You've been at the center of a lot of strange things lately, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. First Brandon, then Eli, and now you show up at Deputy Porter's house. What's going on, girls? Megan leaned forward, her eyes locked on mine. You wouldn't believe us if we told you. Try me, I said. Casey spoke for the first time, her voice soft but full of confidence. Something's happening, Sheriff. Something bigger than you. Bigger than this town. I frowned. What do you mean? Megan smiled again, that same cold, unsettling smile. There's a power here in Silver Creek. It's been here for years, buried under the mountains, and now it's waking up. We didn't cause it, but we can feel it. It's been with us our whole lives. I stared at them, trying to make sense of what they were saying. And what does that have to do with the boys who died? They were weak, Megan said simply. The power, it needs strong people. People like us. They couldn't handle it. Before I could respond, the lights in the room flickered. I felt a sudden drop in temperature and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. The air around the girls seemed to shimmer like the heat rising off asphalt on a summer day. Do you feel that, Sheriff? Casey asked, her eyes gleaming. That's the power, and it's only going to get stronger. I released them later that day, not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. There was no evidence linking them directly to the deaths, no charges I could make stick, but I knew they were involved. I just didn't know how. The next week, 2 more boys went missing. This time, their bodies weren't found. Megan and Casey disappeared soon after. No one's seen them since. I've thought about leaving Silver Creek, packing up and heading somewhere far away from these mountains. But I can't. Something's keeping me here. Some dark force that I can't explain. I don't know where those girls went or what they've become, but I do know one thing. They were right. There's a power here, something ancient and terrifying, something that's been buried for centuries, and now it's awake. The Roaches of Reno. My name's Jake Porter, If you've ever been to Reno, you've probably passed by my shop. It's nothing fancy, just a local pest control business I inherited from my dad. I've been running it for the last 5 years, and honestly, I'm pretty good at what I do. Spiders, rats, termites, you name it, I've dealt with it. But nothing could have prepared me for what I faced last week. It started like any other Tuesday. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when the phone rang. It was some woman, her voice tight with panic. She lived in one of those old apartment buildings downtown, said there was a serious roach infestation in her place. "I need someone here now," she insisted, her voice shaking. "They're everywhere." Roaches aren't anything new in Reno. The city's been battling them for years, especially in the older buildings. But there was something about the way she said it that made my skin crawl. Still, it's what I do, so I grabbed my gear and headed out. When I pulled up to the building, I could see it had seen better days. The paint was peeling, and the windows were fogged with grime. The woman who called me, Mrs. Lawson, was waiting by the front door, pacing nervously. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "They're in the walls," she said, ushering me inside. "I can hear them. It's like scratching. Scratching all night long." I tried to reassure her. "I've seen this before, don't worry, I'll take care of it." I'd dealt with roach infestations hundreds of times, but as soon as I stepped inside her apartment, I knew this wasn't going to be a regular job. The place was spotless, cleaner than most places I work in. But there were roaches, dozens of them, crawling along the walls, skittering across the floor, darting into the shadows. Mrs. Lawson wasn't exaggerating, they were everywhere. I set up my equipment, ready to spray the usual stuff, when I noticed something weird. One of the roaches was bigger than the rest. Not by much, but enough to make me take a second look. It didn't move like the others either. It was slower, almost deliberate, like it was watching me. I shook it off and got to work. By the time I was done, I had sprayed every corner of the apartment, laid down traps, and checked for entry points. The job was clean, and I told Mrs. Lawson the usual spiel. Give it a day or two and the traps would take care of the rest. I thought that was it. That night I was back home, settling in for a quiet evening. The shop had been slow for the past couple of weeks, and I was hoping things would pick up soon. I was just about to crack open a beer when my phone rang. It was Mrs. Lawson again. "They're back," she said, her voice frantic. "You need to come back. Now." I tried to calm her down, told her it would take time, that the traps needed at least a day or two to work. But she wouldn't listen. "They're not like before," she said, almost whispering. "They're bigger, and they're watching me." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I'd heard a lot of strange things in my line of work, but this was a new one. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my gear and drove back to her place. When I arrived, Mrs. Lawson was waiting for me outside, wringing her hands nervously. Her apartment was a mess now, like she had torn the place apart trying to get rid of the roaches herself. I stepped inside, and that's when I saw it. There were roaches, big ones, like the one I'd seen earlier. Only now, there were more of them. Dozens of them. But what really freaked me out was how they moved. They weren't scurrying away like normal roaches do when you walk into a room. They were just sitting there, watching. "I told you," Mrs. Lawson whispered. "They're getting bigger." I stared at them, my skin crawling. They seemed almost organized, like they were planning something. I stepped closer to the nearest one and it didn't flinch. It just stayed there, its antennae twitching slowly, as if it was observing me. I grabbed a can of spray from my belt and doused the roach, expecting it to skitter away or die. But it didn't. It just stood there, soaking in the poison like it didn't even feel it. Then, slowly, it turned and crawled up the wall, disappearing into a crack in the plaster. I turned to Mrs. Lawson. "Did you see that?" She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "They're not normal, are they?" "No," I muttered. "They're not." The next day, I tried to figure out what was going on. I called the city's pest control division, asked if they'd had any similar complaints. The guy on the other end of the line just laughed and told me people exaggerate all the time. They say roaches get bigger every year, but they're just the same old pests. But this was different. I knew it. Those roaches weren't acting like normal pests. I decided to do some research, looking into other cases, seeing if anyone else had encountered anything like this before. That's when I found it. There was an article buried deep in an old newspaper archive from the 1960s. It talked about a roach infestation in Reno. Not just any infestation, though. According to the article, people in one particular neighborhood had reported seeing larger than normal roaches that didn't respond to poison. A few witnesses even claimed that the roaches were intelligent. The article didn't get much traction at the time. Most people dismissed it as hysteria, just some panicked residents exaggerating. But the article ended with a disturbing note. Several residents disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and the investigation was dropped due to lack of evidence. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Could these roaches actually be evolving? Becoming smarter? That night I went back to Mrs. Lawson's apartment. The place was quiet. Too quiet. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I tried calling her, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I had a bad feeling in my gut. I grabbed the spare key she'd given me and let myself in. The apartment was dark, but I could hear something. A faint scratching sound, like the sound of thousands of tiny legs skittering across the floor. I turned on my flashlight, and what I saw nearly made me drop it. The walls were alive. Roaches, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, crawling in perfect patterns, spiraling up the walls, across the ceiling. But they weren't just crawling aimlessly. They were forming shapes, symbols, intricate patterns that no normal insect could create. And in the center of the room, standing perfectly still, was Mrs. Lawson. She was covered in roaches, her eyes wide open, but she wasn't moving. It was like she was in a trance. I took a step forward, my heart pounding, but the roaches moved as one, forming a barrier between me and her. Their antennae twitched in unison, like they were communicating with each other. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my van, gasping for breath. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know what those roaches are or how they're able to do what they do. But I'm done with Reno. I packed up my things, shut down the business, and I'm getting the hell out of this city. If you ever find yourself in an old apartment building in Reno and you start hearing scratching in the walls, don't stick around. Because it's not just roaches, it's something else. The waiting place. I've never believed in the in-between. You know, that space between life and death where people say you hover when you're close to crossing over. It always sounded like some fanciful idea to ease the minds of the grieving, a way to make sense of losing someone without accepting the finality of death. But that was before it happened to me, before I found myself in that place. It started on an ordinary day, one of those crisp autumn afternoons where everything feels sharp and clear. I had taken a hike through the woods just outside of town, something I'd done 1,000 times before. The trails were familiar, and the trees had always been a comfort. I was thinking about work, my to-do list, mundane things that seemed important at the time. That's when I heard it, the sound of running water, but louder than usual. There wasn't supposed to be a stream nearby, yet I followed the noise, thinking I must have taken a wrong turn. The trail wound deeper into the woods, and that's when I saw it. A lake, calm and still, shimmering under the late afternoon sun. I hadn't remembered it being there. As I stepped closer to the shore, something felt wrong. The air was too quiet. The birds had stopped singing, and the wind had died. Even the trees seemed unnaturally still, like they were holding their breath. And then I saw him. He was standing on the opposite side of the lake, just on the edge of the forest. A man, wearing a long white shirt, his figure shimmering in the strange light. I couldn't see his face, but I felt an overwhelming pull to walk toward him, to cross the water and meet him on the other side. The distance between us seemed to shrink and expand at the same time, like some impossible optical illusion. Then, before I could move, he was gone, vanished. When I came to, everything had changed. I wasn't in the woods anymore. I was lying on a cold metal table in a sterile white room. The ceiling above me was high and bright, lights too harsh for my eyes. I tried to sit up, but something was wrong with my body. It felt heavy, sluggish, like I was moving underwater. I looked around. The room was empty, but there were faint voices in the distance, muffled and distorted. I swung my legs over the side of the table and forced myself to stand. It felt like gravity had doubled, pulling me down with every step. The walls seemed to ripple as I moved, and the light flickered, casting long, distorted shadows. I wandered out into a hallway that stretched endlessly in both directions. No doors, no windows, just white walls and that strange buzzing in the air, like the hum of a far-off machine. The voices got louder, more distinct, but I still couldn't make out what they were saying. I wasn't alone here. I could feel it. As I moved down the hallway, I noticed flickers of movement, shadows darting just out of sight, figures shifting behind the walls. My skin crawled with the sense that I was being watched, monitored, but no one ever came into view. Every time I turned a corner, it was as if they had just slipped away, always just beyond my reach. Finally, I came to a door. It was different from the rest of the hallway, dark, worn, with a small window cut into the center. I pushed it open, and that's when I saw him again, the man from the lake. He was standing in the center of the room, facing away from me, his white shirt flowing like mist around his feet. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice echoing unnaturally in the space. "What is this place?" He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly turned, and as he did, my breath caught in my throat. His face. It was mine. I staggered backward, my mind reeling. It was impossible, but there he stood, a perfect reflection of me, staring back with hollow, lifeless eyes. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His lips moved in a silent whisper, and though I couldn't hear him, I knew what he was saying. "I'm waiting." Waiting? For what? I backed out of the room and slammed the door shut. Panic surged through me, and I started running. The hallway stretched out endlessly before me, but I kept running, desperate to escape that room, that face, those hollow eyes. The buzzing grew louder, filling my head, making it hard to think. I could hear the voices again, clearer now, but they weren't coming from the hallway. They were coming from above, like someone was speaking over an intercom, their words echoing through the sterile air. "He's not responding. We're losing him." I stopped dead in my tracks. Losing him? Who were they talking about? Vitals dropping and prepare for flatline. And then I understood. They weren't talking about someone else. They were talking about me. I wasn't in the woods. I wasn't even in the hallway. I was somewhere between life and death, trapped in a place where time stretched and folded on itself, where reality bent and twisted, just out of reach. I was in the waiting place. Suddenly, the hallway began to dissolve around me. The walls melted into darkness, the light overhead flickered and died, and I felt myself falling into a void so deep and vast that it swallowed everything. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I heard was the voice overhead. "He's gone." I woke up in a hospital bed, gasping for air. The room was quiet, sterile, the beeping of machines steady and rhythmic. My body ached, but I was alive. They told me I had been in a coma for days, that I had been found unconscious in the woods by a hiker who happened upon me. No one knew what had happened or how I had gotten there. But I knew. I had seen what waits on the other side, the place between life and death. The waiting place, where time stretches on forever and you're never truly alone. And the worst part? I'm still waiting. The Carnival Underneath. I'm not sure where to start. It feels like everything that's happened these past few days couldn't be real, like I've stepped into some strange nightmare that I can't wake up from. But here I am, writing it down because I need to make sense of it all. My name is Derek Foster. I'm a reporter for the Mobile Tribune. Not a great one, not even one of the full-timers. I cover whatever oddball assignments they throw at me, small-town fairs, random human interest stories, that kind of thing. So when they sent me to cover a traveling carnival that set up shop outside the city limits, I figured it would be just another dull piece. Take a few photos, interview some performers, and call it a day. God, I wish that's what it had been. The carnival rolled into town about a week ago. Nothing fancy, just a ragtag group of tents and trailers on a muddy patch of land off the highway. People said it had been coming through Mobile for years, but I couldn't remember ever hearing about it. The place had a name, Carver's Traveling Marvels, the kind of old-fashioned sideshow name that made you think of snake oil salesmen and bearded ladies. There was something off about the whole thing. The posters felt too old, like they hadn't been changed in decades. I met up with the guy running the place, Eddie Carver, a gruff man in his 50s who looked like he'd been working in carnivals his whole life. His hands were calloused, and he had the kind of rough voice that made you wonder how many cigarettes he'd smoked in his time. "What's this story for again?" Eddie asked as he showed me around, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Just a piece for the local paper," I told him, trying to keep it casual. "People love to read about these traveling shows." Eddie shrugged. "Fine, just keep out of the trailers. That's our personal space." I nodded, jotting down a few notes as we passed the attractions. Most of them were what you'd expect. Carnival rides, food stands, and some sideshow tents with signs promising the Lizard Man, the Incredible Rubber Woman, and other outdated gimmicks. But then we reached the far end of the grounds where a large, tattered tent stood. The sign outside read, "The Carnival Beneath," in faded red letters. "What's this one about?" I asked, trying to mask my curiosity. Eddie paused, his expression unreadable. "That's the underground show. It's for VIPs only. Special attraction." "Underground show?" He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes dark under the brim of his old hat. "You wouldn't be interested." But he was wrong. I was very interested. I spent the next few hours interviewing performers and taking photos for the article. The usual stuff, nothing that stood out. But I couldn't get that tent out of my head. The Carnival Beneath. What kind of carnival had an underground show? And why wasn't it open to the public? As the sun set and the lights of the carnival flickered on, I hung around near the tent, waiting for Eddie to leave for the night. When the crowd started to thin out, I slipped inside. The tent was bigger than it looked from the outside, and as I stepped through the entrance, I saw a narrow set of stairs leading down, literally underground. It was dark, the only light coming from a single dim bulb hanging above the stairs. Every instinct told me to turn back, but I couldn't. This was a story I had to chase. I descended the stairs, my heart racing. The further down I went, the colder it got. The air was damp and heavy, and by the time I reached the bottom, I could hear a faint sound, a low murmur like whispers in the dark. The room at the bottom was huge, far bigger than the tent should have allowed. The walls were dirt, reinforced with wooden beams, and there were small, makeshift lights strung across the ceiling. In the center of the room was a stage, an old creaking platform with a red velvet curtain. There were people in the room, maybe a dozen, all sitting in folding chairs, staring at the stage with wide, unblinking eyes. They didn't seem to notice me as I slipped into the shadows at the back of the room. A low voice came over the speakers, echoing through the underground space. "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Carnival Beneath." The curtain parted and a performer stepped onto the stage. At first glance, he looked like a regular man. But as he moved into the light, I realized something was horribly wrong. His limbs were too long, his joints bending in unnatural directions. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were black, like empty voids. He didn't speak, just stood there, swaying slightly as if waiting for something. The crowd remained silent, their eyes fixed on him. Then, slowly, he started to dislocate his limbs. First his arms, then his legs, bending them backward with sickening cracks. The audience didn't flinch. They watched, mesmerized, as the man continued to contort his body in impossible ways. I felt sick. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped by some invisible force that kept me watching. The performer twisted and bent until he was little more than a twisted mass of limbs on the floor. Then, with a final crack, his head snapped backward, and the lights went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and the whispers started again, louder this time. I could feel the air change around me, thick with something I couldn't explain. Something wrong. The lights flickered back on and the stage was empty. The performer was gone, and the audience was staring blankly ahead, as if nothing had happened. I didn't wait. I turned and bolted up the stairs, my chest tight, my mind racing. I stumbled out of the tent and into the night, gasping for air. I didn't write the article, I couldn't. Something is wrong with that place, with those people. The Carnival Beneath isn't just a sideshow. It's something darker, something older. I don't know what they are, those performers, but they aren't human. I haven't gone back to the carnival, but I still hear the whispers sometimes. At night, when I close my eyes, I can feel them, like they're just beneath the surface, waiting. If you ever see Carver's Traveling Marvels come to your town, do yourself a favor. Stay away from the Carnival Beneath. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed these tales and want more nightmares to keep you up at night, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Your support keeps the darkness alive. And hey, don't forget to share your 5-word nightmare in the comments. I'm ready to be creeped out. See you in the next one, if you dare.